let's look at Ecclesiastes 2. I'm going to read the first 11 verses there, and then we're going to jump over to chapter 5 and look at some verses that are going to lead us into chapter 6. We're going to sort of synergize between those two things, a couple of themes that I think this passage is talking about today. So Ecclesiastes 2, verse 1, this is again Solomon writing. He says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure, enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works, I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the children of men. Does this describe what you guys have in your households, by the way? Not very. So we have a hard time relating to some of the things he's getting at, right? But these are kingly things, right? As the king over Israel, with lots of resources available to him, he's building gardens and fruit trees and vineyards, and he's got servants, right? He's got slaves and musicians and people that are purely attending to his every need, okay? And that's what he's doing. He's acquiring all these things for himself. So verse 9 says, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. All right, so kind of keep that all in your heads, and let's jump over to chapter 5. Chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 10 through chapter 6, verse 2. All right, and we're going to kind of compare and contrast these two sections, okay? So verse 10 says, he who loves money, chapter 5, verse 10, will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. There is a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. Doesn't sound like a very happy scenario, right? Verse 18, behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the joy in his heart. I'm going to read just a couple verses here of chapter 6. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. A man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. Okay. Hello, guys. Thanks for joining us today. So let's just kind of talk about the things that stick out to you. So as I'm reading those verses to you, what are the things that kind of grab your attention? And what do you guys think the theme of this section that we're talking about is? I try not to put my back to everybody over here. Yeah. What do you guys think those two sections are dealing with? Go ahead, Dar. Okay, so we're not going to be satisfied in worldly possessions, wealth, money, any of those kinds of things. Okay? No? Okay. Yeah, no, so I think you actually phrased that really well, the idea that we shouldn't focus on gaining earthly possessions or things on this earth that aren't going to last, but there are heavenly things that we should be aspiring to pursue. That's really good. We'll come back to that. Other thoughts? What is this section saying? What are some things that kind of grabbed you as we were reading? So if you wanted to kind of give it like a label, you could say materialism is an idea here. And that's something that we are, whether or not we have houses full of gardens and fruit trees and, singers and all that kind of stuff like Solomon has, right? We still identify as Americans with materialistic kind of thinking, don't we? Right? Simply by virtue of being the wealthiest nation in the world, you guys might not necessarily think of yourselves as being wealthy, but we do know the materialistic tendency, which is we all need to get the new, one of these when it comes out, right? And we all have to make sure that we're wearing, new clothes and we're not, wearing rags. And, we really would like to have a car with less than 160,000 miles on it for our first purchase, right? Okay. So there are, in that, again, none of those things are necessarily bad, but we identify with the pursuit of physical things on this earth. That's just part of our culture. It's part of our world. And to a degree, I mean, that's an attitude that's going to be everywhere. That's a human thing to want more stuff. Okay. But especially in parts of the world like ours, you see it much more prominently because of the way that our society lives. Okay. Another word we might use to describe this is self-indulgence, right? That I'm going to give myself things that I want. I'm not going to deny myself the ability to enjoy these things. I'm just going to take what I want to be able to enjoy life. Okay. So look real quick at chapter 2. Look at some of the verbs that are there as Solomon is describing what he did. So starting in verse 3, he says, "I searched with my heart." And then in verse 4, he says, "I made great works." Verse 5, "I made myself gardens and parks." Verse 6, "I made myself pools from which to water forests." I bought male and female slaves in verse 7. I had also great possessions of herds. Verse 8, "I gathered for myself silver and gold." I got singers, right? There's this acquisition, right? I'm taking things, I'm getting things. And just imagine, by the way, like the amount of money that is being spent here, okay? Like even in the ancient world, right? This is tons and tons of money that is being spent. I mean, it's money that, if we study the books of First and Second Kings, you see Solomon making lots of really wise decisions, like just from a kingly governing economic kind of position, right? Where he's, his leadership, partly based because God has given him lots of wisdom, but partially because he's just kind of a shrewd guy by nature, is it's paying off. The kingdom is the wealthiest it's ever going to be under Solomon. So he's got money, oodles of money to spend. But the key here, you guys, is not necessarily just in the acquisition, not just in the taking, not just in the spending, but you see that there's that self-indulgent kind of attitude taking place here, right? And the key for me is verse 10, because he says, "Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil," right? You see that, right? I see it and I want it, so I don't deny myself. I take it, right? You guys see that in that verse? See it, I want it, I take it, all right? And that's kind of the attitude he has. Now, he qualifies it a little bit. He talks about how he still has his wisdom in verse 9. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. And that he says it was a reward, like he worked for it, so it was a reward. So let me throw a couple of questions at you guys, and we'll kind of start our dialogue a little bit this way. In that theme of self-indulgence, of doing things that we want to do, what are some things that are good to do? Okay, just not morally reprehensible. Okay, good things to do that you shouldn't do all the time. What are good things to do that you shouldn't just do all the time? Keep it simple. Good things to do that you shouldn't do all the time. Yeah. Yeah, right? You don't, I mean, at least where you guys are, like you sometimes want to spend more time with your friends and your family, right? Which, okay, that's good, right? You want to spend more time with your friends, but you also can't neglect your family. You also can't neglect the responsibilities you have to study, right? To do things that are important in that time too. So that's a good thing, but we shouldn't do it all the time. Okay, Dar? Eating food, right? Okay. Overeating, right, to indulgence, right, is a problem. I mean, there's great food out there. There's lots of food that is both worthy of being Instagrammed, right, and also food that's worthy of putting in your belly. Okay, but like we shouldn't do that all the time. There's a moderation kind of principle that should take place there with food. What else? What's the other natural one? Okay. Right. Yeah. Social media becomes your drug of choice when when you're on it all the time. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's one that you want to be in moderation of how much you're going to use social media. What else? Sleeping. That's what I was thinking of, right? It would be so nice to be able to sleep all the time, however long you wanted, right? Get up whenever you wanted. And so certainly there's a benefit to taking a nap, right? There's a benefit to getting a good 8 hours sleep, or 10 or 12. But like, sleeping is a good thing. Your body needs it. But if you were to sleep all the time, the Bible actually uses sleep as a sort of analogy, or rather not sleep in terms of resting, but overindulgent sleeping, constantly sleeping as connected to laziness, sluggard. The sluggard or sloth is the old King James kind of way to describe it. Right, and sleep is something that's connected to that. So that's another one. Right, there's all kinds of things we could say. There's lots of good things that we can do. Right, that if we were to do them too much, they would become self-indulgent in that way. So again, there's not necessarily anything in Solomon's list that is like, whoa, that's like over the top sinful. I mean, in our day and age, our culture would really balk at the idea of having slaves, just purely based on what we know of slavery in our world, and that's a hot button issue even now as we're thinking about this. But slavery in this context would have been more like an indentured servant versus slaves in a field or something like that. Be more like these people had no way to pay for their debts, and so Solomon purchases them. And they become, part of his household, as it were. Whether or not he treats them fairly, I mean, you want to believe that Solomon, a man after God's heart, would do that. We don't know to that extent. So, but the point, nevertheless, is that it's just that overindulgence and all these things that is kind of the issue. Okay, you guys have heard. I already hinted at that expression, right? Everything in moderation. You guys have heard that expression, which apparently people who do diets hate that expression. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. I was just kind of Googling some things today. And there's all these people that are like, the title of their article is why we should stop saying everything in moderation when you're on the Whole30 diet, and why we should stop saying everything in moderation when you're on this diet, right? Because yes, okay, it's all calories. Yes, you can kind of balance it out, that kind of thing. But it's just hard, right, to maintain a good diet and also allow yourself to eat chocolate cake. All right, like that's just challenging. So anyway, but I was thinking, I found this article on actually Psychology Today. It was talking about the fact that our culture, yes, I'm going to quote Psychology Today in a lesson. Anyway, it's talking about the extremes of our culture and how in today's day and age, and this article was 2 years old, so even 2 years ago it's true, today it's true. Just this idea that we are all about extremes, right? So in other words, they're saying you can never be too rich or too thin, right? Is a persistent message that we hear in our culture. Never be too rich or too thin. People aren't capable of watching just one favorite TV show. They have to binge the whole season, right, at one time, okay? Can't have too much TV, all right? Forgoing sleep and basic needs to do that kind of stuff, right? If you like those real estate shows, anybody like watching those like home revamp shows, or like, where you're like, that's a dream treehouse or something like that, right? You can gawk at garish celebrity compounds with 21 bathrooms, or at the opposite extreme, tiny houses, right? 100 square foot micro houses, okay? Many people have no problem downing a Hardee's monster thick burger. Anybody eaten at Hardee's anytime recently? Okay, Hardee's is like more down south, but they're around here too. But that thick burger is apparently 1,300 calories in one burger. Not to be outdone by the Sonic peanut butter and cookie dough Dream Master Blast, which is 1,870 calories. You can believe that. 1,870 calories, okay? And then the opposing camp, right, the other extreme, is anyone who recoils in horror at a teaspoon of added sugar or a gram of gluten, right? So like the extreme of, I can't have anything indulgent versus the extreme of, don't deny yourself anything, right? And those are the two extremes of our culture. Anything that happens to anyone today is either super awesome or it's the worst thing ever. Okay, that's kind of the way our culture thinks in those extremes. Okay, and that's not just, again, our time, not just our culture. I think we see hints of that even in Solomon's experience. But notice he also justifies what he did, because he said, again, in verse 10, I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was the reward for all my toil. In other words, I worked for it, so I earned it. So I deserved this, right? That's kind of a mentality you can see there. That's a mentality that we have too. I worked hard for something, so therefore I deserve. I got all my work done, so I deserve to watch my entire 30 episodes of my TV show on Netflix tonight. Okay, like that's kind of the way we think about our time sometimes. And so self-indulgence becomes very justified, become entitled to good things for the hard work that I do. Now, the conclusion that he's going to draw, we're going to kind of see this now, and then we'll come back to it at the end of our time today, is that attitude. So he's confessing to the fact that that's what he did, right? This is how I lived in my pursuit of pleasure, my pursuit of trying to figure out what the meaning of life was, okay? His conclusion is not that is good. And I think we see that right away, because in verse 11, right after he says, this is what I did, okay, this was my reward, this is what I thought, this is what I did. Verse 11 says, then I considered all that my hands had done and the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. So you see that turnaround real quick there, right? He's not saying, oh, everyone should do what I did. Rather, this is what I did. It was empty. Okay? It was empty. I pursued all these things. I bought all this stuff. It profited me nothing in the end. And if we peek ahead, okay, so we actually didn't read all the way down to verse 9 of chapter 6, but he actually makes this conclusion there after the section we read. He says, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and is striving after the wind. In other words, it's better for the eyes to see clearly what is important in front of you, right? Than for the appetite, your belly is sort of an image for your desires, okay? To constantly be wanting more, constantly be wanting more. That is vanity. That's worthlessness, okay? So that's his conclusion. Let's see what are some things that we want to take away from that. One of the questions I asked you guys is, why is it important that Christians be careful about how we spend our time? Okay? Because again, when it comes to self-indulgence, one of the issues that we have is a time management issue. All right? What we do with the time that we're given. So why do you guys think, this is an opinion question, so whether or not you did the homework, you can answer this. I mean, why is it important that we as Christians need to manage our time well? What do you guys think? Give me some reasons why we would manage our time well, or why we should. Okay, Noah. Okay. So in a sense, you want to diversify the time you have. There are lots of things to do, lots of responsibilities, as well as the spiritual disciplines you mentioned that we should be engaging with. Okay. So yeah, maybe time is, because it's not something we have an unlimited supply of, we have to kind of put it in the different places that are most important. Okay. What else? Allie first. Sure. Yeah, so stewardship is a big aspect of a lot of the things we're talking about today. That God gives us things that he expects us to use for his glory ultimately, and also for his kingdom, for one another. So we actually want to be good stewards of it. It's really easy to waste. Yeah, right? Time is that, how many of you guys have ever been like, I can't remember the last time this was actually the case for me, which may be a good thing. How many of you would say, like on a long like summer afternoon, would say, I'm bored, there's nothing to do. I'm bored, there's nothing to do. Okay, right? So this is kind of the seconds ticking away kind of thing to think about, right? When I'm bored and there's nothing to do, and I just kind of want to wait for the next big thing to happen in my day, right? Like that's a moment for me to kind of take ownership of my time. All right, to recognize that, you know what, yes, there is not necessarily anything that's immediately sensationally grabbing my attention right now, okay, but how can I take this moment, because every second is, gone. Like the second that I just passed, I can't get that back, okay? And so just having a mindset that it's so easy for me to miss the opportunities, right? That the seconds that God has given me, the minutes God has given me to invest in something meaningful or to do something, right? Redeeming the time. It's so easy to waste my time. Okay. Other thoughts? Go ahead, Grace. Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Did you want to add more to that? I'm sorry. But yeah, like what I choose to do with my time. So like Noah, you brought up, playing video games, doing things like, studying our Bibles, praying, right? There's certainly nothing sinful about, playing video games, but like how many of my time chips do I place there versus in being with friends versus in studying the Bible versus in ministry versus all the other ways that I could spend my time. And certainly if I were to do a time budget, if I were to like keep track of everything I did every 15 minutes in the day, that would be pretty revealing. What is it that I spend the most time doing? Okay. Lord, please don't let it be doing my hair in the mirror. Okay. Like that's the kind of thing you look at that and think man, I just sunk a ton of time into, getting ready to get out the door versus, man, I could have spent half of that time just praying. Right. And I would be in a much better place, spiritually speaking, to face the day. So yeah, time reveals how we spend it, reveals our values. Other thoughts? Why it's important that we manage our time well? I'll just add one more thought because I think you guys are you're tracking in all the right directions, right? We just aren't guaranteed more of it. Okay? We aren't guaranteed more time. In other words, while it's not the most pleasant thing to think about, who's to say that we all don't walk out of here and get in car accident on the way home, right? And all of a sudden our time is gone. And then you just have to think, well, what could I have done in that window that God gave me, that would have been glorifying to him, that I missed out on that opportunity. So I think it's just important that we recognize, and that's a big theme in Ecclesiastes, you guys, is just that, yes, things are cyclical. Yes, they happen again. Yes, chasing after the wind, that's kind of the imagery he uses. It's this pointless thing, but we're also very, very here for just a short span of time, and there's no guarantee that tomorrow is actually going to be here for us to take advantage of. So we need to use this moment now. All right. And I think Christians are called to that. Okay. Gracie, you mentioned, how we spend our time communicates what we value. Do we demonstrate our love for Jesus and his people in the way that we spend our time? The next question I asked was, is it wrong to have lots of possessions? Is it wrong to have lots of possessions? Why or why not? Go ahead, Tori. Yeah. Yeah. How do you start to idolize those possessions? Yeah. What would you run back into your house for in the event of a fire, right? That's a way to think about it, maybe. Right. Yeah. Do I put more weight on those things than my time with the Lord, than my time with his church? There's all kinds of ways to evaluate that. Again, as Americans, we better hope it's not wrong to have lots of possessions, okay? Because if you just did an inventory of your room, you'd probably be astounded at how many things you own, okay? Even, just in one room, right? The things that we own, there's just thousands and thousands of possessions that we have. And again, when we compare it to Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 11, we'd be like, oh, I don't have that much. I don't have gardens, okay? But the reality is we do have tons of things. We have tons of possessions. So it's not wrong to have them. But maybe the question is, what do we do with them? And what is the weight that we place on them? This is kind of a similar question, but what is something good that we shouldn't have too much of? This is another question I asked you. What is something good that we shouldn't have too much of? Any thoughts? Another opinion question. What would you say if you were to kind of think about our culture, our world? Nobody should have lots of X. Nobody better say guitars because I have lots of those. just something to think about, a little food for thought. I mean, again, it's not wrong to have lots of possessions, but maybe the way that I want to think about that particular question, and we don't have to come up with an answer for it, is just the more that we have, the more we should be willing to give. All right. I think that's a big message in the scripture because, by the way, all the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, even the book of Job, they all classify wealth, physical possessions, like being well off in this life, as a sign of righteousness, and the fact that you have been wise in your dealing, and the fact that God has blessed you, in just dealing well with other people in your life. So it's always like sort of associated with righteousness. But it's also the other side of the coin is, man, wealth is dangerous, right? Wealth is always, it's never said as something that in and of itself it's sinful, but there's great potential for you to trip over all the things you own, sometimes literally, okay, in order to please the Lord, okay? And so maybe my follow-up question is then, what is it that makes having lots of possessions challenging to our faith? What is it about wealth that makes it such a dangerous thing to a believer? What do you guys think? Yes, sir. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, what you have, you want a little more, right? It's not really going to satisfy you ultimately. I can't remember the celebrity. I don't remember if you remember this, Michael. There was an interview a few years ago, and the question was asked, very, very wealthy individual, what would make you happy? And the answer was $1 more. I can't remember who it was. It was like it was like a baseball player or somebody. Might have been Aaron Rodriguez. I don't remember. But the answer was $1 more would make me happy. So, as a man who has millions of dollars. But it's that idea that the more you have, the more you want. You're never satisfied if that's where your treasure truly is. Why else would having lots of possessions by being materially wealthy be challenging for Christians? What do you guys think? Tony? Yeah. Right. Yeah. If I find my identity in that, if I find all my happiness and spend all my time with my things, what happens when that fire comes? What happens when all my material possessions are gone? What's going to define me then? Okay. How about just the simple practical fact that the more you have, the more you have to worry about, right? Like if you own things, you have to maintain them. You got to take care of them, okay? And the more you have, the more you got to worry about. That's why actually over in chapter 5, what do you say, verse 12? Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep, right? There's a dissatisfaction that comes with having too full of a belly, and I think it's that idea that a wealthy person, yes, they've got lots of great things that they can enjoy, but now they got to have a great home security system. Now they got to keep checking their Google Home to make sure that nobody's like walking on their property when they're not there, right? I've got to install the burglar alarms, right? Like I gotta maintain and protect that stuff when it's mine. And so there becomes, yes, I enjoy it, but I also have to work to keep it good. And so that's challenging, right? The more stuff you have, the more you have to maintain. The more stuff you have, the less able you are to steward it well, because you just have all these things you're holding on to, and it requires your attention. And ultimately, anything that we hoard or that we covet can become an idol. Something that we live with as the biggest priority in our lives will sort of replace the true love that we're supposed to have for Christ and for others. That's why, Jesus in Matthew 19, he said, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy man to enter heaven. And again, not saying that wealth is evil, but just the difficulty of holding on to both of those things, kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. Also, First Timothy talks about how, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Again, it's not money, but the love of money. that becomes the root of all kinds of evil. So we just have to be cautious of that, again, because as Americans, whether or not you like to think of yourself as wealthy, but even as a teenager living in America in your parents' house, right, you are wealthy, you have lots of things. We got to be aware of this. We got to be aware of the way our materialistic thinking can impact our heart of worship and impact our heart of love and service for others. Okay. So we've talked about this a couple of times. Let's touch on it briefly. We keep getting this reference to life being vanity. It's here and then it's gone. Could also mean meaningless. Solomon is he's trying to find, as he's searching through all these different things in life, what is the meaning of life? And so I asked you guys the question, is there ever an appropriate time to think about life as being truly meaningless? As a Christian, would we have that attitude? Is there ever a time where it's appropriate to kind of think of life as not having a purpose? Why or why not? What do you guys think? What would you think if you heard another Christian saying that their life was meaningless? Would that be something you'd be like, yeah, you're right? Or that's something that you would try to challenge them on? That's it. Mm. Okay. Yeah. So Sarah, I don't know if you guys all heard Sarah said, if you're still living, there's a purpose to your life, right? God has given you that. Would anyone disagree with that? Would anyone have other thoughts to add to that? What else would you say to someone who was in that position where they thought their life was meaningless? Yeah, sorry.
I'd say that that thought process could help you get your priorities straight for consumed by something that's important. But it's a really slippery slope.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, I think you're getting at some of the tension that we even see in the text, which is like, you're like, how could a guy who loved the Lord say some of those kinds of things in that bleak tone? And yet he is kind of, he's speaking from the experience of coming to the end of himself and realizing how worthless all the things were that he was pursuing. But yeah, to like come to that point of saying, you know what, life is going to be meaningless if I don't change something, right? If I don't take full advantage of the time and the resources God has given to me. Yeah, but you don't want to live there. Right. So if you think about, again, I'm only using the example because Noah threw it out there, but video games, there's nothing wrong about playing video games. I love playing video games, but if that were where I put all my time, that would be meaningless, right? Sorry, man. Preaching to myself too. Okay. Like if that's my only priority, that makes my life meaningless in that sense. Okay. Tony? Yeah. Yeah, that's an awesome thought, Tony. Just to remind ourselves that we were of value to the Lord because he paid for us. He bought us. Those are the terms that the Bible actually uses, purchasing kind of terms, which means that we had value to him. Okay, that's awesome. And so someone who's in that position, that frame of mind, questioning whether life is meaning needs to be reminded of that. Okay. Any other thoughts? Pain, circumstances in our lives, pandemics, right, sometimes can make us feel like things are hopeless. And certainly Solomon bumped up against some of that thinking, right? But I think that the conclusion that we need to walk away from is even where there are things that we need to address and change, even where, my priorities need to be reoriented, even where maybe I've wasted a lot of time. There's never a point, especially as a Christian, but there's never a point where any human being should ever come to the conclusion that their life is not worth living anymore, right? Because there's always something that God wants to accomplish in you. I mean, we are not the author of our of our first breath any more than we should be the author of our last breath, rather, right? God has called us to this moment, this place, and this time, and he's doing something in and through us, right? He's doing something in the world around us. And it's amazing to think about. How many of you guys have ever seen that Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life? A classic Christmas movie. You guys should all watch it, right? If you haven't, it's worth watching at least once. You know, it's a classic. But anyway, part of that story is George Bailey wondering what would happen if he had never lived, right? And so the angel Clarence, who's trying to earn his wings, because that's the story, right? He's okay. Let me show you what it'd be like if you weren't here, right? And all these terrible things happen to all the people that were in George's life, and and it's like you meant something to these people, even though you felt like a failure, even though you felt like your time was being wasted, even though you felt like you were beating your head against the wall with all these issues you're running into. Your life had meaning, okay? And so I think it's important that we recognize that we can't judge the value of our lives any more than we rightly can determine when they should end. And ultimately, God is at work in those things. God is an active God in all of these areas, okay? By the way, even godly men in the Bible wrestled with feelings of dissatisfaction and that kind of pain. Not just Solomon, but like David, right? His father wrote all kinds of things. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Rejoice in the Lord, right? And renew your strength. Elijah, right? After he beats the prophets of Baal, remember, he retreats to a cave and is like, I shouldn't live anymore. That my life has no meaning. And really all he needed was a nap and a meal, right? That's what the angel of the Lord brings to him. Okay, but anyway, there's people that wrestle with this, godly people who wrestle with this. So, we're not alone if that's been our experience of feeling like, I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know why God has given me this life to live. But we have to trust him and follow him in the process and not just assume that we are the ones who determine whether or not our lives have meaning. Okay. All right, let me see. I'm going to jump ahead because we're starting right out of time. So Solomon says, this is in verses 3 and verse 9 of chapter 2. He says, even while he was pursuing wealth and pleasure, his wisdom remained with him, right? Verse 3, says, I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. And then he also mentioned in verse 9, as he's becoming great, surpassing all who were before me in Jerusalem, also my wisdom remained with me. So my question is, as he's sort of describing what he's doing and the fact that he has wisdom, does that mean that what he was doing at the time was wise? In other words, is he saying it was super wise of me to drink lots of wine in an attempt to understand whether that can bring happiness and contentment? Is he saying that, as I became this wealthy, great, proud king over Israel, that was a wise thing for him to do? What do you guys think? Why do you think he makes that specific reference to the fact that he still possessed wisdom even as he's doing these things? This is a tricky question, by the way. What do you guys think? How can someone who is, arguably the wisest man to ever live make some of the choices that he makes here, all right, and then make a statement like, my heart was still guiding me with wisdom? I don't know. Interesting. Yeah. Which doesn't make it any better, does it? Right? No. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. So Ellie's saying, there are lots of people who, when they make, mistakes, as it were, when they sin, sometimes they're self-deceived. They don't necessarily see clearly that the actions that they're committing are deeply sinful. And Solomon is, because he's so wise, he probably knows that in the process, even as he's doing it, that it's not going to bring him the answer that he's looking for. and yet that's what he's choosing to do anyway. That's one way to understand this. Yeah. What else do you guys think? Do you guys think that what he was doing was wise? I mean, would you recommend going out and drinking lots to figure out what the meaning of life is? Okay. Probably not. Okay. Probably not going to, it's going to give you some kind of answer, but not the answer that is going to glorify the Lord. Okay. So there's a couple of thoughts here. One is, there's a big difference between spiritual wisdom and practical wisdom. So in other words, doing the things that are going to bring the most glory to the Lord versus doing things that are, sort of, you can make the argument that what he's doing is wise, that he's systematically trying things, saying, no, that's not the answer, and moving on from it. So in other words, one of the definitions of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? Which is both humorous and true. But he's not doing that. He's not saying, okay, let me try wine again. It didn't work. Let me try wine again, right? That's not what he's saying. But versus, I tried this, it didn't work, and now I'm trying something else. That could be seen as a type of practical wisdom. I'm trying different things to try to get to an answer. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that, God gave Solomon this great gift of wisdom because he asked for it, right? He could have asked for wealth and he didn't. He could have asked for power and he didn't. He said, Lord, give me wisdom. So God doesn't withdraw that gift from him. That's another thing to think about. And additionally, I think we mentioned this before, but wisdom is not just like this unconscious ability that like you just can't help but be wise. It's like you have to use that gift. So to possess wisdom doesn't necessarily mean that I always do the wisest option that's available to me. You guys see what I'm saying? Like all of you are very, very intelligent young men and women, okay? And yet all of you at some point, probably within this week, have done things you said, that was kind of dumb. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have said that, okay? And if you were to, stop in each moment and evaluate what's the wisest choice available to me, you might make a different choice than what you had made previously, okay? So that's maybe a comparison. He's doing things that are not wise, and yet he still has this trait, this ability that he could tap into should he choose to, but he's choosing instead to do something else, to be self-indulgent as an attempt to understand whether that's really going to bring happiness in the time that he has. Okay. Now he does say that his heart is guiding him with wisdom, so there's some type of wisdom that he's accessing there. Another way to think about it is that Solomon didn't indulge himself so excessively with wine that he lost the ability to think with genuine discernment. In other words, yeah, maybe he drank a lot, but he didn't drink so much that he couldn't think anymore. Okay, that's another way to maybe understand that. Either way, Solomon is not prescribing that we follow the same footsteps that he took. You guys with me in that? Nowhere in the book of Ecclesiastes does he say, do what I did and you'll understand what the will of the Lord is. He's going to caution against almost every single thing that he did and just kind of point and said, this is what I tried and it was meaningless. This is what I tried and it was meaningless. And his conclusion is going to be something totally different. Okay. Last question. I think this is sort of an obvious answer, but the reason why needs to be extrapolated a little more. And we'll kind of finish with this. Do you guys think God wants us to enjoy our lives? Do you guys think that God wants us to enjoy our lives? Yeah, I see some nods. I see some smiles. Anyone want to venture an answer, Asa? Interesting. Yeah, no, I think you made some really good points there, right? So at least this life is not going to last forever. That's one way to think about it. And he wants us to yearn for something beyond just this life. Okay, there is something that's going to come after this. Dar? Mm-hmm.
But then also wants us to know you have a certain purpose in this life.
Okay. Yeah, so he created it, so it's got to be good. Okay, that's good. Other thoughts? Should we enjoy our life? Does God want us to enjoy our lives? Yes, sir. Mm. Mm. That's interesting. So the meaningful times of our lives are often the most painful in that regard. Not always. There's certainly some very meaningful times in our lives that are very joyful. But it's interesting to think about the hardships that we walk through as maybe, Asa was referencing, sort of pointing our perspective to something beyond just the here and now. Those are painful, they're not enjoyable, but they're meaningful. But God does give blessings. He does give us things to enjoy. Okay. Any other thoughts? So maybe, a question to clarify a little bit is, how is it that we live? Or in other words, what does it mean to lead a fulfilling life? Because maybe that's where some of our clarification needs to be. If life means having that kind of self-indulgent perspective that I just do what I feel like or whatever feels good, then the answer is going to be no. God doesn't want me to live that way. He doesn't want me to enjoy life that way. That's a very superficial kind of enjoyment when it comes to understanding eternal things. However, if life means finding joy in things that are wholesome and pleasing to the Lord, then the answer is yes, because he gives us these things, okay? As a matter of fact, look at, as we close, look at chapter 5, verses 18 and 19 and 20. It says, behold, this is a conclusion, right? What I've seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given to him, for this is his lot. In other words, it's good for someone to take pleasure in the work that God has given him to do, the life that God has given him to live, because we have this very brief, punctuation mark, okay, of time here on earth. So we should enjoy that, right? There's a gift of God attached to that. It's good for us to do that. However, if, what we're getting at is, if you hold too tightly to that, then we're going to miss the joy. We're going to miss the opportunity that we have to glorify the Lord with that punctuation mark. So there are tons of other passages. One of the questions I asked you was, can you think of some other Bible passages that talk about what God's priorities are for man? And so what I want to just, you guys can look up some of those if you want. Psalm 16 is a great one, which really highlights the fact that God wants us to live rich, fulfilled, and holy lives all at the same time. And I think what I want to leave you guys with today is this, all right? Having satisfaction in life is going to elude those who miss God's priorities and instead value temporary things, okay? In other words, so I'll say that again. Satisfaction is elusive for those who miss God's priorities and value temporary things instead. In other words, if you hold too tightly to the things that you have here, then you're going to miss the enjoyment that you could have in them. Whereas if you hold on to the things of eternity very tightly, all of a sudden you have the ability to enjoy the moment that you have here on earth. You enjoy the things that God has given to us, right? Solomon recognized an evil, he called it an evil in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, someone who has possessions but isn't able to enjoy them. But I think what he's really describing there is an irony, right? That someone has all these amazing things and yet can't take joy in them because they're so obsessed with protecting them, holding on to them, right? And then ultimately, he describes that it's like a father who makes a bad business venture. He gambles the money essentially, and then leaves no inheritance for his son. All right, that's ironic, right? Because someone who had so much wealth should be able to enjoy it in the moment, but because he clung to it so tightly, because he indulged himself, because he was trying to control his own future, he missed the joy that he could have had in that process. So in order for us to enjoy the material, non-eternal things of this world that we live in, we have to value our relationship with God above all else. It's interesting to think about, but I would say even in relationships, that's a true principle, right? So the marriage relationship is supposed to be the closest, most important human relationship that you can possibly have, right? Even in that, you guys, if I don't love Jesus more than I love Tara, I'm not going to love her well. Right. And we miss that. We miss that because this person, I've got to give all my love to this person. It's true in one sense, but I ultimately need to love Jesus more, worship God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, in order to love her and care for her the way that a wife deserves, right? And then we can find really true joy and true meaning in the time that we have together. The same thing is true of all of our possessions, of all the relationships and friendships that we have, of all the things that we own, okay? In order for us to enjoy them fully, the way God intends us to, we have to find our true joy in him, and then we're able to actually take joy in this time, in the work that we have, and in the fact that God has given us this blessing of stuff here on earth. Does that make sense? There's not really another great analogy. The marriage one is the one that I always go to, but just kind of recognizing that you hold too tightly to the things in front of you and they slip through your fingers. But if you have a big perspective on what has God called me to do in this life, I worship him with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And all of a sudden, everything that's close to me comes into greater perspective, and I see it for what it was really intended to be. That's what I want to leave you guys with today. Any thoughts or questions, comments on any of that stuff? Anything we didn't talk about from the homework that you wanted to talk about? No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to ask Avery to pray. Okay, let's close, and then I'll let you guys get out of here. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for bringing us to this place and this time to have this conversation. And Lord, I don't know which individual in our group today really needed to hear this, but I just trust that as your Spirit is working and has brought them here, that you would impress this message on their hearts. Lord, I pray that we as your children would not take greater delight in created things versus our Creator. Lord, we are so thankful for our homes, for our things, for the people in our lives, for the time and the abilities that you've given to us. But Lord, let us not be distracted with lesser things. I pray that we would have a kingdom mindset, that we are yours, that we are stewards of the good gifts that you give. And Lord, we are to be loving those in our lives to the greatest extent, because you set the example for us. You came to earth for us. You died for us. And so we have all of these things that are intended to be, tools to minister to others. So I just pray that we'd have that mindset, Lord, not just seeking to serve our own interests, but Lord, seeking to lay down what we have for the needs of other people. Lord, I pray that we have that mindset. I pray that we would really live that out in our day-to-day lives. And Lord, ultimately find our satisfaction in you, because like we've been studying, nothing in this world is ultimately guaranteed or permanent. And Lord, we just need to cling to what is eternal. So thank you for the fact that you've given us this understanding. Help us to live according to it, to find joy and peace and contentment in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, awesome. If you guys wouldn't mind, help us stack up the chairs, and then we will turn you loose into the wild. Consider yourselves tagged and released back into the ocean. And we'll meet again on Thursday.